Speaking of functioning, you guys have boasted some pretty high connection rates. I've seen 200K thrown around for active connections. What have been some of the biggest challenges getting to that scale, and what surprised you about real world usage patterns?
Every single app that we have worked with and every single like developer team that we've worked with has like a dramatically different story around their network. And it's been wild to sort of like experience that. Just to give you some like examples. Yeah. Like we've worked, like everybody in the streaming video space often has just like a silly number of concurrent connections, like a bonkers, like the liveness property of apps that have voice and video chat built into them. Really like just like it, we very quickly had to scale the relay servers to be able to do 1 million concurrent connections. Like that was a prerequisite for working in that space. In contrast, some of the more data intensive stuff, we've been doing a lot of work lately in and around the AI and like AI training of actual LLMs. And they really exchange like a lot of data in these bursty rounds. And so like each node will be producing like on the order of tens to low hundreds of megabytes of data that needs to be broadcast to everybody, but in very specific moments. And like we ran into this problem where like, oh shoot, we had way too much data actually flowing over the relays. That like 1 kilobyte thing I talked about earlier, we had like these machines are so high powered that they were able to jam tens of megabytes into the pipes before anything could even happen because they're really high powered machines. And so like we just had a completely different deployment pattern and usage pattern. And then like also just like stuff that showed up out of the wild that we really didn't expect as kind of these off-label use cases. We're getting a lot of people using Iro now, even in the cloud, because it has service portability, right? You just take that key and you'll move it around anywhere. Some of that could be running on GCP, some of that could be running on AWS, some of that could be running on Hetzner, and you just talk to services by key. And as long as you like, you can get the throughput that you need, it's a really convenient way to get portability in the cloud. And we're all of a sudden like, that's not like peer-to-peer. Like we don't have hole punching problems. These are publicly dialable devices. But like oddly, a lot of the folks we're working with do have hole punching problems. And a lot of it's like configuration of the firewall and your VPS and like all of this like sort of like infrastructure gack of DevOps that Iro had really helps glaze over, where now it doesn't really matter if your app is being deployed to an employee's laptop or to a cloud VM. They both just sort of like get keys and talk to each other. And that has made for like a really interesting sort of usage pattern. So we've seen some wild stuff. Like it's been absolutely wild scaling this thing for real. The last thing I will say on that topic though is the coolest bit about peer-to-peer networks is the scaling characteristics. You can get this thing called sublinear scaling out of peer-to-peer, where it is genuinely possible to run tens of millions of devices on a Raspberry Pi as the relay server, right? Which is just like a bonkers thing, because you have to kind of invert the model of thinking. The client is the server now. It can do server things. And so every time you onboard a new user, you're adding a server, you're adding capacity to your network. And that when those people are talking over direct connections, that has no usage bill to you, the service provider, right? And so as the dev, you are able to get bonkers scaling characteristics. And that is just like, that is formerly known as sublinear scaling, which is the idea that as you add capacity, the total cost per unit goes down. And like most of the time that we talk to people, they sort of like, when they think about peer-to-peer, they're like quietly in the back of their head thinking of like BitTorrent. And they're like, well, that made my computer hot. and we are well beyond that world. We're in a world where like the amount of traffic that a single node in some of these apps will do is smaller than the ads you would be downloading in another app, right? Where it's just like you can do one request an hour. And if you have 1 million users doing 1 million online at a given point, and they all do a request every hour, that's 1 million requests that you could serve, right? And so the capacity, just the scaling characteristics are completely different from anything that you see in a normal sort of space. And that's where the real magic shows up. And like, sadly, with peer-to-peer networks, and I think this is part of why they kind of die, is like you don't get to see that benefit when you're like 10 nodes, just starting off and you're building an app from scratch. Where that magic really shows up is when you hit some of these scaling moments. And if you're prepared for it, you all of a sudden just watch your costs level and they no longer go up. And that's like a really wonderful moment. But like the number of teams that get to see that moment are quite low. And so I think that you don't see a ton of advocacy for peer-to-peer in the wild because it's really hard to get there.
Yeah, that's wild to think about. Maybe like I guess when I was first thinking of like the network topology, I was like just thinking like, traditional is like, oh, Bob wants to contact Alice, like Bob contacts the relay helps establish a direct connection to Alice. But like, there's something that I didn't think about is like if there are like multiple people in the channel and like someone else is already connected to Alice, is it possible to hop between them? Is like, I mean, are you doing like these like sort of dynamic typologies, or is it really just trying to, as much as you can, just establish a direct connection between the two users?
Two devices. And this is where we have lots of space to iterate. And so some of our protocols do actually have that hopping characteristic where things will move through peers, and some of them don't, right? We have leader election algorithms where like, hey, you want to run raft consensus, you want to pick one node, you want it to be the sort of like driver of the conversation. And so this is the fun part about stopping boiling the ocean and saying, no, let's leave that open as a design space. All of those, even if you're doing hops between nodes, those are still pairwise connections, right? And so the primitive you need at the end of the day is being able to dial one device to another. Even if you're building a broadcast system, I won't bore you with the academia, but like we all of our connectivity on the internet is based on this device talking to that device, and well, actually, to get really specific, this port and that port is sort of discussing something with each other. But yeah, it's and I think you're sort of like at the doorstep of why we got into this game in the first place, which is really yes, we get like peer-to-peer is the way that we express our goal, but we think about ourselves as a user agency company, not as a peer-to-peer connectivity company. If you kind of like, just to get a little meta for a second, I don't know, are y'all familiar with the dead internet theory? Like, just to like quickly elucidate that this idea that like the public internet is like kind of dead. It's just full of robots and like people that have like really kind of made it very difficult to know if you're actually talking to a person, what the motivations of that people are. And what we're sort of seeing, whether you come from the very privacy conscious side of things, or where you're just like kind of wandering through the internet these days, wondering whether this is AI or not, you're experiencing a bit of a loss of agency. You're experiencing this like, oh, I can't do all the things that I used to do, and I sort of have lost a degree of control. And a lot of that is really characterized these days in terms of like, hey, being more privacy conscious and like de-Googling and all this stuff. Sure, but like I think in practical terms, what a lot of people are doing is they're just retreating into the cozy web, which is like Discord channels, WhatsApp groups, and like Signal and whatnot. And that's you claiming agency back. You're saying, hey, I want to be able to like take control over who's part of this conversation and how this is sort of like working between people. You're seeing this in Blue Sky at the top level of this, where it's like, hey, we want to be sort of like really concerned about who runs and controls these public systems of dissemination. But the reason we care about P2P is our core thesis is that if you want to take that conversation to its natural conclusion, those cozy conversations, those Discord channels are really where the internet is going. That's where we're all going to be sort of like building and working and iterating. And so that means the world's going to look more like Signal. Like the internet isn't dead, it's just changing. We're changing the way that we talk to each other. And so we need systems for building stuff that looks and behaves more like Signal and less like Facebook, right? And for that, we really need to kind of come up with this like missing primitive, which is like, how do I have an encrypted end-to-end connection to the person that I'm talking to, right? And specifically. And we think that's kind of the step function change that we're trying to anticipate and be a part of. And we think this like electric engine is just fundamentally missing from the networking stack. We need to be able to do this stuff. We need to be able to construct these apps that know how to dial our friends without ever dialing some home server, right? And like what developers choose to do that with that, it's totally there. That's like up to them to decide how to use that technology. But for us, we're like, this needs to exist and it needs to be robust and it needs to be sort of on the level that is comparable with HTTP, right? And that's kind of why we're doing what we're doing. We're really sort of like trying to facilitate this set of tools that will allow developers to build that next generation of apps. It has these incredible scaling characteristics. It's possible for some kid in a college dorm room to ship an app to tens of millions that will cost them on the order of hundreds to thousands of dollars. That's a really cool byproduct. But it also means that person could ship an app that's competitive with big incumbent things because it is both lighter and ships more capabilities to the end user's device. And so that's the internet I want to live in. And so that's the sort of change that we're trying to facilitate, where I can have not necessarily more privacy, but just more control.
Yeah, there's strong echoes there with the like local first movement. I mean, so we ran into each other at Local First conference, and that's been a big conversation in that space is like agency and control and connection. You know, it's like local first, not local only is the thing that I like to say. It's like it's still important to have connection, but like sort of maintaining some agency in that space is important. So I like your framing on this. And I think a good transition here is like looking at local first apps and edge computing. What do you see are like the next big opportunities for peer-to-peer networking? So like, what is the opportunity space here in the next few years?
Yeah, and I think to like build on that sort of like long-winded rant, I think if you like really zoom out and go back at like what the internet sort of like did to us in the beginning is like we initially got the ability to associate according to interest instead of place, right? Like if you think about the way that why the internet was really popular, all of a sudden like you could talk to people that shared your interests, not just people who lived in the same town as you. And I think now with this like cozy web conversation, thanks Maggie, who is a friend of the local first movement. Maggie Appleton is the author of the cozy web article that I'm drawing a lot of this from. I think the cozy web is actually the reinvention of place on the internet. I think we're in this space where we're now saying, hey, actually, we want some of that place back. We want a context where we can say, I know who I am in that space. I know my identity and I know who I'm talking to. And that can feel like a familiar watering hole. And to me, that reinvention of place and having that be driven through direct connections is the real opportunity, is the moment where it's like, okay, can we ship apps that like kind of feel more like chat apps, but can bloom in functionality a lot and can all of a sudden say like, oh, cool, let's just like flip in some video voice chat in there. And like, let's just like add some like new sort of like, let's jump out of this Telegram and into some game that is only a part of this thing inside of this cozy placemaking space. And that's where we like really want to see iteration improvement. I think that's where we see a bunch of UX and some of these networking primitives really interacting in interesting and meaningful ways. And so we're really gung-ho on that space in particular. And we think that that's the most, and like that is like straight up local first, right? Like I went to local first conf because I was like, this is, and came back from it super excited. That community is talking a lot and struggling a lot with like sync, and like that's like a core sort of challenge right now. And I think in talking with a lot of the local first folks, it's just like, well, if somebody could ship us good peer-to-peer, that would be nice. And like, and this is part of where we're like excited about this evolution. There's a maturity now that wasn't here 5-6 years ago, where like people really wanted to invent that whole stack themselves, really wanted to do all the peer-to-peer networking themselves, and like it kind of didn't work well, and like and it ended up being too big. You spent too much for your innovation budget, and so now I think you're seeing this modern approach, particularly sort of like typified by the local first movement, where we are now back in a space of composition where we're willing to work together, and like our team is just like kind of hard limited on this like, cool, we're going to do the connection part, and everything else is going to be collaborations, and we have other people who are like, hey, we're doing the sync part. And the networking thing is not our problem. And like, to me, that's really where we start to see that accumulating to a benefit in the end user in the long run. And so, yeah, I really think a lot of things rest on these types of communities. Local first is a great example of it. Getting their act together, shipping things that are usable at scale by like the massive TypeScript community, and like really making sure that that is like, we're putting good tools in people's hands that are grokkable. It's really hard to take P2P quick and turn it into a TypeScript API that's easy to consume and that works in the browser. And like, but that's where we need to go.
Yeah, there's this drama going on in the gaming community right now also, where it's like gamers want to be able to like own their games past when game companies deem those non-profitable anymore. We live in an era where like I'd say probably the last 20-30 years is just gone. Like there's nowhere for it to go. Like it's either held up in a company or it's a service that somebody doesn't want to run anymore. So I see us moving towards this more peer-to-peer thing, and like being able to compose these things and ship those things. Maybe it'll prove longevity for those things, because it makes me immensely sad. Like when TikTok was going to go away, it's like that's like a slice of culture and like history that's just like gone because of how we build applications right now.
And I think you've really hit the nail on the head, right? Like, I think the modern way of shipping an app is to ship half an app.
Yeah.
Like you ship the front end, right? And when we call them front ends, because there's a back of house that you don't get, right? And the core thesis around forget peer-to-peer. All we're saying is ship the whole app, right? Like put the client and the server in the same binary. Yes, it's hard. You don't get the web platform development unless you wander through a whole bunch of WASM GAC, and we're working on it. But like at the core, the game server is like such a great example. We have a couple of projects that are sort of like really building on top of this. I would shout out Jumpy, which was the first folks, and Bones, which is a game engine in Rust. We recently, a community member contributed a Godot or Godot engine plugin. And like this, the core thesis is just like, I don't want the game server to go away. I want to, when I buy stuff, I want to own it and I want it to function so that like, hey, and like you saw this in the gaming community, like, can I have LAN parties back, right? Like, you remember how like we just can't have LAN parties anymore? It's just ridiculous that like we can't all sit in the same room and play the same thing, right? And we have a whole bunch of people in our community crawling through grass to like someone just shipped a UDP socket layer on top of Dumbpipe, which is this Unix socket thing this socket thing that we've built specifically so they could play Counter-Strike with their friends. Like, it's just like, that was what they wanted. And they're like, can we have all of this machinery just fake a UDP socket so that I can play Counter-Strike with my friends? And like, yeah. It's weird that a whole generation has come up only consuming half an app, right? Like it's a bonkers notion.